They laughed at his strange, hill-dug cabin, calling it foolish. But when the temperature inside stayed 55 degrees warmer than the surrounding wilderness, they began to wonder, had he figured out something they hadn't? Before we dive deeper into this incredible tale, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this leave you in awe, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode promises even more unbelievable survival secrets. Samuel Brackett had never been one for the conventional. Born in the mountains of Kentucky, he'd spent his early years running along the ridgelines and learning to build with nothing more than rough-hewn tools and his father's guidance. But after losing his wife to a fever and his farm to the harsh winter of 1851, he set his sights west, driven by the promise of untouched land. The vast wilderness of the Rockies called to him like the deep, eternal hum of a drumbeat. Here, he would carve out a new life, no matter how long it took or how difficult the work would be. His first impression of the land was immediate and brutal. The air felt thin, as if the mountains themselves were pressing down on him, reminding him of their unyielding presence. The wilderness stretched for miles in every direction, the forests dense with trees, the rivers fast and treacherous. Here, there were no easy roads, no soft comforts, only the raw force of nature and the determination to survive. Samuel began his search for a place to settle, surveying the land for a site that might offer some protection from the coming winter. Most of his fellow settlers and trappers built cabins near running water. But Samuel knew better. He had learned early on that water, though essential, could also be a threat. Flooding, freezing, and the unpredictable movements of the rivers could easily ruin a life. Instead, Samuel sought out higher ground, a ridge tucked away from the river, but still within reach of the forest. The spot he chose was not what anyone would have called ideal. It was barren of trees, but what it lacked in wood it made up for in shelter. The ridge itself was made of solid earth, covered in a few scattered patches of snow. Samuel felt the familiar tug of his old instincts telling him this was the right place. He spent weeks preparing the ground, clearing brush, and creating a small clearing for his cabin. At first, the other settlers laughed at him. They didn't understand why anyone would build in such a place. There were no big trees to use for building logs, no easy way to haul water. But Samuel had something they didn't: knowledge of the land and the way it worked. As the weeks passed, Samuel's work grew more methodical. He dug into the hillside, slowly carving out space for his cabin within the earth itself. His design was simple but revolutionary, a cabin built into the very earth that would protect him from the bitter winds of winter and the dangers of the wilderness. The work was grueling, the digging was backbreaking, and the labor stretched for days on end. But Samuel's mind never wavered. He had seen too many men die in poorly built cabins that could not withstand the winter's fury. He wasn't going to make that mistake. Each log he placed, each stone he stacked, was done with the precision of a craftsman. This was not just a shelter, it was a fortress. When the first snowfall arrived, Samuel stood back to admire his work. The cabin, partially dug into the hillside with a roof sloping toward the sky, looked like an extension of the mountain itself. It was small, but sturdy, and from the outside, it looked as though it had grown naturally from the earth. The neighbors laughed and called it a joke. They didn't see what Samuel saw: a haven from the cold, a place where he would be warm while the storm raged outside. Winter arrived sooner than anyone had expected. The first snowstorm hit in mid-November, and by December, the mountains were blanketed in an unrelenting sheet of white. The wind howled down from the peaks, carrying with it the promise of more snow, more cold, more isolation. Samuel's cabin, dug into the hill, became his sanctuary. The walls, made of earth and logs, kept the biting cold at bay, and the warmth from the small fire inside seemed to cling to the air, trapping heat in a way that made the place feel almost cozy. The neighbors, who had initially laughed at his unconventional design, began to take notice. They were freezing in their flimsy log cabins, their fires barely making a dent in the frigid air. They could see smoke rising from Samuel's cabin, and some began to wonder, was it truly warmer inside his strange, half-buried home? One evening, as Samuel sat by the fire, carefully splitting wood for the next day, he heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a neighbor, a man named Jacob, who had spent much of his life in the mountains. Jacob looked wind-blown, his cheeks red from the cold, and his breath came in sharp, desperate bursts. "I don't know what you've done, Samuel," Jacob said, his voice hoarse, "but I can't take this cold any longer. The wind's been howling for days, and my cabin is barely holding together." Samuel didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, allowing Jacob to enter. The warmth in the cabin hit him immediately, and he gasped in relief. "This place is incredible," Jacob muttered. "How's it so warm in here?" Samuel smiled and leaned back in his chair. "It's the earth. It holds the heat better than you might think." He gestured to the logs stacked by the fire. "I built this cabin to survive the worst the mountains could throw at it, and so far it's done just that." As the storm raged on outside, the two men sat in silence, warming themselves by the fire. Samuel's cabin stood as a quiet testament to the idea that survival wasn't just about brute strength or weaponry, it was about using the land itself, the very earth, beneath their feet to build a home that could withstand anything nature threw its way. As Jacob left the next morning, he turned to Samuel and said, "I'll be back. I think it's time I started building something like this myself." The word spread quickly through the neighboring cabins. The once ridiculed, buried cabin was now the subject of whispered admiration. Samuel had built something that not only protected him from the storm, but also kept him alive. And the others began to see the wisdom in his strange design. The winter storms came without mercy, one after another, each colder and fiercer than the last. By mid-January, Samuel had not seen a single clear day. The snow continued to pile higher, and the wind screamed through the mountain passes, turning the world outside his cabin into a swirling, frozen nightmare. But within the thick walls of his hill dwelling, Samuel felt only the steady warmth of his fire and the quiet hum of survival. The neighbors, still struggling with their poorly built cabins, began to visit Samuel more frequently. Some came to take refuge from the brutal cold, while others, like Jacob, came to learn. It was during one of these visits that Samuel realized just how much his ingenuity had caught the attention of the frontier community. Jacob entered the cabin, his face red from the cold. He pulled off his gloves, shaking his hands in front of the fire. "I've seen cabins that look a lot more like homes than yours, Samuel," he said, his voice still gruff from the freezing air outside. "But they don't stand up to the storm like yours does." Samuel nodded slowly, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "It's not about how it looks, it's about how it works. The earth holds the heat better than wood does. These walls are thick, and the logs are tight enough that not even the cold can find its way in." He motioned to the small window above the hearth. "The design lets me keep the warmth where I need it, right here, inside." Jacob seemed to ponder this for a long moment. "You've got a way with this place. How'd you learn all this?" Samuel smiled, though his gaze remained fixed on the fire. "I didn't learn it from anyone else. I had to figure it out. The wilderness can break you if you let it, but it can also teach you if you're willing to listen." Outside, the wind howled even louder, rattling the logs of the cabin. Samuel could hear the sound of the storm growing more intense, but it felt as if his cabin had become part of the landscape, as if it was grounded into the earth itself. It was a small victory, something he had built with his hands that was now keeping him safe from the chaos outside. Later that evening, as the storm raged on and Jacob prepared to leave, he looked around the small cabin. There were no frills, no luxury, just the bare essentials. But it worked. "I'll be back, Samuel," Jacob said, his voice serious. "You've changed how I'm thinking about all this. You might have just given us all away to survive this damn wilderness." Samuel nodded, but as Jacob stepped out into the storm, Samuel's thoughts turned inward. He didn't seek recognition or praise. He only wanted to be sure he could survive. His mind was already working on ways to improve the cabin, perfect the design. After all, the wilderness would never stop testing him. By February, the storm hadn't relented. Samuel had long since run out of firewood near his cabin and had to make daily treks deeper into the woods, searching for downed trees to fuel his hearth. The work was exhausting, the snow growing deeper with every step. The air was thin, and Samuel's breath came in ragged gasps as he hoisted logs onto his back, making his way back to his cabin. The weight of the logs felt heavier each day, and he could sense that the wilderness was pushing him to his limits. As he trudged through the snow, Samuel thought of the others, those who had ridiculed his design and now sought his refuge. They had been the first to mock his unconventional cabin, but now they were the ones with frozen fingers and empty hearths. He didn't mind the visits, but the weight of their dependence on him felt like a burden he hadn't expected. One day, as he made his way back from the woods, Samuel saw smoke rising in the distance. It was coming from the direction of Jacob's cabin. He quickened his pace, heart pounding. Something was wrong. When he arrived at Jacob's cabin, he found the door kicked open, the wood splintered and broken. Snow had piled high against the walls, and the wind had torn the door off its hinges. Inside, the stove had gone cold, and Jacob was nowhere to be found. Samuel's stomach twisted. He knew Jacob hadn't made it far. The storm was too intense, the cold too severe. He quickly gathered what he could and set out, following the trail of footprints in the snow. After several miles, he found Jacob collapsed, frozen nearly solid, in a shallow ravine. The man's face was half covered in snow, his arms outstretched as if reaching for help. Samuel knelt beside him, feeling the familiar weight of loss settle into his chest. This was the wilderness at its cruelest. It took, without warning, without mercy. Jacob had been strong, capable, but he had underestimated the storm and overestimated his shelter's ability to hold. Samuel felt a surge of guilt. He had known the danger, had warned Jacob, but there was no way to predict such a violent turn of events. With a heavy heart, Samuel buried Jacob by the side of the ravine, marking his grave with rocks, just as he had done for his lost loved ones back home. There would be no more visits from Jacob, no more hopeful conversations about building better cabins or surviving the wilderness together. The storm had claimed another soul. Samuel returned to his own cabin, his thoughts heavy. The brutal reality of the frontier had never been so clear. His cabin might keep him warm, might keep the cold at bay, but it was no guarantee against nature's wrath. The wilderness would always find a way to test him, and Samuel wasn't sure he had any more answers to give. As he sat by the fire, Samuel thought about the future. The cabin might have kept him safe for now, but the wilderness was an ever-present threat. The landscape had a way of breaking a man's spirit piece by piece until he had nothing left but the will to survive. Samuel didn't know how much longer he could keep up with the demands of this harsh, unforgiving land, but for now his cabin would continue to offer him shelter, warmth, and a place to gather his thoughts. That, at least, was something. Spring began to emerge from beneath the weight of winter. The snow was slow to recede, but beneath the blanket of white, the earth stirred with life. Samuel watched the world outside his cabin transform, though his thoughts were clouded with the events of the past months. The storm, the loss of Jacob, and the harsh isolation of the wilderness had worn on him. Yet there was no time to dwell on grief. The land had a way of demanding attention, and Samuel knew that he had to adapt if he wanted to survive. It had been months since he had first crafted his cabin, and Samuel couldn't help but think of how much he had learned since then. The simple design had been born out of necessity, but now he was beginning to see how it could be refined. The logs, the placement, the insulation, all had worked well, but there was always room for improvement. The wilderness required constant adaptation, and Samuel was learning that the smallest changes could make the biggest difference. One afternoon, as Samuel sat by the fire, he began sketching ideas in his journal, the pages filled with crude diagrams and calculations. His mind raced as he considered how he could enhance his cabin's insulation, how he could make it warmer, stronger, more efficient. He thought about the way the earth had kept the warmth inside, the way the cold had never truly penetrated his walls. What if he could extend that concept, make the earth an even greater ally in his survival? He wasn't an engineer or architect, but he had seen enough to understand the basic principles of structure and heat. Using the terrain to his advantage was the key, and the hill he had built his cabin into had given him an edge no one else in the area could replicate. Still, there was a risk of becoming complacent. Every time a new storm came, Samuel wondered if his cabin would hold, if his solution was enough. That night, as the wind howled outside, Samuel worked into the early hours, planning an expansion of his shelter. He decided to dig deeper into the hillside, extending the cabin further into the earth, not just for space, but to create a more stable, warmer environment. He envisioned a larger living area, a space to store supplies, and even a small root cellar for food. He knew that he would need more wood, more materials, but his mind was already on the design, the method. The earth, the logs, the insulation, all needed to work together in perfect harmony. Samuel had always been a man of simple means, but this was something different. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was about creating something that could truly stand the test of time. The thought of improving his shelter gave him a new sense of purpose. It was no longer just about surviving the next storm or winter. It was about crafting something that was more than just a refuge. It was about making a statement. This cabin, his cabin, would stand as proof that even in the harshest conditions, with only the simplest tools and materials, a man could survive and even thrive if he was willing to adapt, learn, and keep pushing forward. The weeks passed slowly, as they always did in the wilderness, with time marked only by the weather and the chores that had to be done. Samuel had set his plan in motion, carefully digging further into the hill, expanding the structure of his cabin, reinforcing the walls, and adding more earth to thicken the layers of insulation. His hands were raw from the digging, his muscles aching from the labor, but he found a quiet satisfaction in the work. This was his life now, the rhythm of toil, the simplicity of purpose. It was on one of these long, solitary days that Samuel saw something unexpected. As he worked outside, hauling logs to add to the growing structure, a figure appeared on the horizon, moving against the backdrop of the distant mountains. At first, Samuel thought it might be a figment of his imagination, a trick of the light. But as the figure drew closer, he could make out the shape of a man trudging through the snow, moving with determination. The man was a stranger to Samuel, someone he hadn't seen in the nearby camps before. He was tall, with a rugged face and a thick beard, and he carried a rifle on his back. Samuel's first instinct was to retreat into the cabin, but something about the man's presence, calm, purposeful, made him reconsider. He knew that the wilderness was unforgiving, but he also knew that survival often depended on alliances. When the man arrived at the cabin, he didn't make any attempt to approach immediately. Instead, he stood in the snow, studying the structure before him. It was clear he was curious, perhaps even skeptical of what he saw. Samuel met his gaze, waiting for the man to speak first. "You built this?" the stranger asked, his voice rough from the cold. Samuel nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I did. Took a lot of work, but it's held up well." The man glanced at the cabin, his eyes narrowing as if calculating its strength. "I can see that. Most men would have thought it too much trouble, digging into the earth like that." "It's not the easiest way," Samuel admitted, "but it works." The stranger nodded slowly, seeming to weigh Samuel's words. "I've heard talk in the camps. Some say you've got the best shelter in these parts. I reckon that's true." The compliment surprised Samuel. He wasn't used to hearing praise from other men, especially in the wilderness. People out here didn't waste words on niceties. If they spoke, it was usually out of necessity. "I'm building an extension," Samuel said, gesturing to the new area he had started digging into the hillside. "I'm trying to get as much warmth and space as I can." The stranger studied him for a moment, then asked, "Mind if I take a look inside?" Samuel hesitated, but then, as if driven by a quiet curiosity of his own, he nodded. He had nothing to hide. The man stepped inside the cabin, his boots leaving prints in the dust of the dirt floor. He looked around, his eyes scanning the walls, the hearth, the makeshift shelves Samuel had created. There was nothing extravagant, nothing that spoke of wealth or comfort, but there was something else, a sense of purpose, of ingenuity. "This is the kind of shelter a man can depend on," the stranger said, his voice thoughtful. "Most of us have to make do with what we've got, but you've gone a step beyond." Samuel wasn't sure how to respond, but he felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of pride for the first time in many years. Perhaps it was the loneliness of the wilderness that made the praise seem more valuable, or perhaps it was the recognition of his hard work from someone who had likely spent just as much time in the wilds. "You planning on staying around here?" Samuel asked. "I might," the stranger said, turning toward the door. "I've got some land a few days west of here, but I could use some advice on building something solid, like yours." Samuel smiled faintly, the weight of the work ahead of him momentarily forgotten. "I'll show you how to get started." The stranger nodded in thanks and stepped outside, his silhouette fading into the snow. As he disappeared from view, Samuel stood for a moment, his thoughts turning inward. Perhaps this cabin, his creation, wasn't just a refuge for himself. Maybe, just maybe, it was something bigger, a legacy. As spring slowly turned to summer, the cabin that Samuel had so painstakingly designed began to evolve into something more than just a shelter. The earth that had served as his insulation became more than just a barrier against the cold. It now held the promise of something greater, safety, comfort, and a way of life that he had only dreamed of when he first arrived in the harsh Rockies. But Samuel knew that it wasn't enough to simply design a sturdy shelter. The wilderness was relentless. Even with the best of intentions, nature could still find a way to tear down the unprepared. And so, while his cabin was built to withstand the cold, to trap warmth like a secret, Samuel still faced the ever-present test of survival. One morning, as the sun filtered through the dense tree line, and the air was cool, but not yet warm, Samuel was out collecting firewood when he heard the unmistakable sounds of something large moving through the brush. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but he hesitated. Over the years, he had learned to observe before reacting. The sounds weren't those of a bear or elk, but something lighter, footsteps. He crept quietly toward the edge of the forest, carefully choosing his path so as not to disturb the underbrush. When he broke through to a clearing, he spotted the intruder, a grizzly bear, its massive body lumbering through the woods. Samuel froze, his hand still clutching the rifle, but his eyes never leaving the bear. The animal didn't seem to be in a hurry. It was sniffing the air, moving leisurely as though it owned the land. Samuel's pulse quickened, but he didn't make a move. He had learned that shooting a bear on sight wasn't always the best way to protect oneself. Sometimes the creature would simply move on, but then the bear changed course and headed directly toward the cabin. Samuel's heart sank. He knew that if this bear came upon his shelter, it would likely try to enter. Grizzlies were relentless, especially when they were hungry or curious, and there was no guarantee that his cabin, though stronger than the average structure, would hold against such a powerful creature. Without a second thought, Samuel sprang into action. He ran toward the cabin, taking the long way around, carefully, making his way through the trees to avoid drawing the bear's attention. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his body as he reached his cabin just in time to see the bear approach. The bear tested the door first, as Samuel had predicted. It shoved its massive weight against the wooden frame, clawing at the gaps between the logs. The sound was like a freight train crashing against the walls, and for a moment Samuel felt a rush of panic. Would his design hold? Then the bear paused, its sharp claws digging into the soft earth surrounding the door. It shifted to the corners, testing for weaknesses, pushing against the reinforced sections of the cabin that Samuel had painstakingly designed to prevent such an assault. Samuel held his breath, watching through a small gap in the wall. The bear circled the cabin once, twice, before it finally gave up. It let out a frustrated snort and turned away, walking back into the woods as if the cabin was no threat. Samuel stood frozen for a long moment, the relief flooding his body. His cabin had withstood the test. The earth, the logs, the reinforced corners, the tight-fitting door, all had held firm under the strength of the grizzly. As Samuel lowered his rifle, a small smile tugged at his lips. The design, which had once seemed so unconventional, had proven itself in the harshest way. The wilderness had tested him, and for once it had failed to break him. The summer months brought with them not just warmer temperatures, but a renewed sense of purpose for Samuel. The grizzlies' visit had only solidified his belief in his design, and as the days stretched long and the sunlight lingered in the sky, he continued to perfect his cabin. It wasn't just about surviving now, it was about refining the craft, making sure each element of the shelter worked harmoniously with the next. He had started working on a small addition to the cabin, expanding the living space and constructing a more efficient storage system. The root cellar was now complete, the perfect addition for preserving food through the cold months. He spent hours in the evenings making careful adjustments, from the fire pit to the chimney, from the door to the windows, ensuring that every detail was precise and functional. One afternoon, as Samuel was working outside, he heard the sound of footsteps again. This time they were familiar. Jacob, the neighbor he had helped earlier in the year, appeared at the edge of the clearing, carrying a heavy pack on his back. He was smiling, but there was a tired look in his eyes. Samuel wiped his hands on his pants and walked over to meet him. "Jacob, it's good to see you," Samuel said, offering a hand. Jacob grasped it firmly, his grin broadening. "I thought I'd take you up on that offer," he said, nodding toward the cabin. "I've been thinking about it a lot since I left. The idea of building something like this, it's a lot more than just shelter. It's a way to live." Samuel didn't know what to say. The offer had been casual, an offhand comment when they first met. But now Jacob was serious, and there was something in his voice that told Samuel he wasn't just looking for advice, he was looking for a change. "I've got a piece of land not too far from here," Jacob continued. "I've been trying to make do with the cabin I've got, but after seeing what you've done, I know I need something stronger, something that'll last." Samuel nodded, his thoughts racing. He had never intended for his cabin to become a blueprint for others. He'd built it out of necessity, not to start a trend. But now, standing before Jacob, he realized that his creation had become more than just his refuge. It had become a symbol. "I can help you," Samuel said after a moment. "It won't be easy, and it'll take time, but if you're serious about it, I'll show you how to build something that'll hold, no matter what comes your way." Jacob's face lit up, and he dropped his pack to the ground. "I'm serious," he said, his voice filled with determination. Samuel smiled faintly, a feeling of pride swelling in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to become a mentor or a teacher. But in that moment, he understood that the legacy of his cabin wasn't just in the materials or the construction. It was in the knowledge, the way he shared it, and how it could change lives. Word had spread, and Samuel's design had caught the attention of those who needed it most. The cabin that had once been mocked for its unconventional approach was now the standard, the model for those who understood that survival wasn't just about building, it was about creating something that would stand the test of time, no matter the storm. The summer stretched on, the days growing longer and hotter. As Samuel and Jacob worked together, gathering materials, cutting wood, and slowly but surely bringing the plans to life. Jacob's land, though not far from Samuel's cabin, was a stark contrast in terms of the challenges it presented. The land was uneven, with several hills rising in the distance, and the forest was dense with undergrowth, making it difficult to find the right trees for construction. But Samuel wasn't deterred. He had worked in much harsher conditions, and he understood how to adapt. Each day they would work side by side. Samuel had already begun to see Jacob's potential. Jacob wasn't a stranger to hard work. He had spent his years as a hunter, a trapper, skills that translated well into the laborious task of building. He was meticulous, too, though still a bit skeptical about the unconventional methods Samuel used. But as the days wore on, Jacob began to trust in Samuel's judgment. The first step was clearing the site, marking out where the cabin would sit. Samuel had always believed in choosing a location that offered not only protection, but also an element of visibility, something that could give him a chance to spot potential threats from a distance. Jacob's plot didn't have the same advantage of high ground as Samuel's own land, but it had its own set of strengths. The hill would provide some shelter from the wind, and the surrounding trees could offer enough wood to get them started. "I know it's not as high as your spot," Jacob said one morning as they surveyed the land, "but I think it'll work. What do you think?" Samuel examined the area carefully, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You've got a good spot here. It'll take some extra work, but I think we can make it solid." Jacob nodded, though the skepticism in his voice was still evident. "Solid? I've been here for 2 winters now, and the wind always seems to find its way through the cracks. I'm just hoping this cabin of yours holds better than the one I've got." Samuel smiled, his eyes glinting with quiet confidence. "It will. But it'll take time. The first thing we need to do is dig in like I did. The earth will help us hold the heat, keep the cold out." And so they began. The first few days were focused on digging the foundation into the hillside. The work was slow and laborious, but Samuel was determined to make sure every detail was accounted for. He explained the process to Jacob as they worked, showing him how to identify the right logs, how to strip the bark carefully, and how to prepare the earth. As the foundation began to take shape, Jacob's skepticism slowly faded, replaced by a sense of purpose. They had something to build, something that would last. Samuel's vision was starting to take form, and as the days passed, the cabin began to look more like the one Samuel had constructed for himself. By the end of the month, they had the main frame in place. Samuel stood back, surveying the progress with a satisfied expression. The foundation was solid, the walls were going up, and Jacob was beginning to see the potential of the design. "This is looking good, Samuel," Jacob said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I didn't think we'd get this far in such a short time." Samuel glanced at the sky, noting the early evening light. "It's a start, but the real work is still ahead. We'll need to make sure the corners are reinforced and the chinking needs to be tight. A cabin built to last isn't just about how it looks, it's about making sure every joint, every seam, is tight enough to keep the cold out." Jacob nodded, the fire of determination now clear in his eyes. "Let's keep going. I'm ready to finish this thing right." As summer waned and the crisp air of autumn began to settle over the Rockies, Samuel's focus shifted from the work of building to the unpredictable weather that could strike at any moment. He had known, from years of experience, that a sudden change in the weather could make or break a survival plan. And as they finished the main structure of Jacob's cabin, the winds picked up and the clouds began to darken on the horizon. One evening, as Samuel and Jacob worked on adding the finishing touches to the roof, the first gusts of wind blew through the trees, whistling past them with a cold bite that made both men pause and look up. Samuel squinted at the sky, noting the growing storm clouds that were rolling in faster than he expected. The weather in these mountains was unpredictable, and Samuel knew that a storm could hit with little warning. "We're cutting it close," Jacob said, wiping his brow as he worked to secure a few more planks of wood to the roof. "You think we'll make it through the night?" Samuel paused, considering the sky. The wind was picking up, the trees beginning to sway. "We're close, but it's going to be tight. We'll need to get those logs secured before it hits." Just as Samuel spoke, The wind howled through the trees, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, followed by a sharp crack of thunder. The storm had arrived, and it was fierce. The temperature dropped quickly, and the rain turned into a torrential downpour, slashing against the trees and the cabin. Jacob looked at Samuel, his eyes wide with concern. "This storm is something else. I don't think we're going to make it through without a fight." Samuel met his gaze, his expression steady. "We've got this. The cabin's solid. It'll hold. But we need to make sure everything's secure. The wind's the real danger now." They worked quickly, moving to the corners of the cabin to secure the logs that hadn't yet been fully fastened. Samuel's mind was sharp, his experience guiding him through the process. The wind screamed around them, the rain now turning into sheets that soaked everything in its path. The sound of the storm was deafening, but Samuel didn't falter. This was what he had built for. By the time the worst of the storm had passed, the cabin had held firm. Samuel and Jacob stood side by side, looking at the structure that had withstood the elements. The roof was secure, the walls unshaken. The wind howled outside, but the warmth inside was undeniable. "That's the real test," Samuel said, nodding toward the storm-ravaged landscape outside. "We'll never stop the wilderness from testing us, but if we build it right, we can endure it." Jacob stood silently for a moment, the weight of the storm still heavy in the air. "You were right. This cabin, this is a place that can stand anything." Samuel smiled, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not just about surviving the storm. It's about knowing that when it's over, you've built something that'll still be standing." As the days grew shorter and the cool winds of fall began to turn the leaves golden and red, the cabin Samuel and Jacob had built together stood firm against the elements. The storm had tested them, but it had only reinforced the strength of their efforts. It was the beginning of something greater than just two men surviving in the wilderness. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond forged not only by necessity, but by the shared experience of turning raw materials and hard work into something that could withstand the most brutal forces nature had to offer. The neighbors, who had once laughed at Samuel's unconventional cabin, had begun to notice the changes in the land. Word had spread about the sturdiness of the cabin, about how it had withstood the storm, and about how the design Samuel had pioneered was beginning to change the way people thought about survival. The more the news spread, the more people began seeking him out, not just for advice, but for help in building their own homes. One crisp morning, Samuel and Jacob were sitting outside taking a break from their work on the new cabin when they heard footsteps approaching. A group of settlers, their faces weathered from months or years in the wilderness, walked up the path towards Samuel's cabin. "I'm not sure if we're being visited by curiosity or desperation," Jacob said with a wry smile, glancing up from the fire. Samuel looked toward the group, recognizing a few faces, men who had shared a meal or a drink at the local tavern. They were familiar with the struggles of the mountains, but now they had come seeking something different. The leader of the group, a tall, grizzled man named Will, stepped forward. "Samuel," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty. "We've heard talk about your cabin, about what you've built here, and we wanted to ask, how much would it cost to get your help? We've got a piece of land near the creek, and our cabins aren't holding up. The winters are getting harder, and we can't keep rebuilding every few years." Samuel considered the request for a moment. He had not expected his work to inspire such interest, and the thought of building more cabins for others was a daunting one. But he also understood the desperation in Will's voice. The wilderness had a way of breaking people. It had broken him too, and if he could offer them something that might make their lives easier, he felt obligated to help. "It's not about money," Samuel said, his voice thoughtful. "It's about building something that lasts. If you're willing to put in the work, I'll show you how to build it. It'll take time, and it'll take patience, but it will hold." Will nodded, relief washing over his face. "We're ready. We've heard enough stories to know that if you're willing to teach us, we'll have something we can depend on. We're tired of rebuilding every year." Samuel looked to Jacob, who met his gaze with a knowing nod. He had learned the trade, and now it was time to pass it on. "Let's get started then," Samuel said, standing up. "But first, we need to clear the land, get the foundation right. If you want this to last, you'll need to do it right from the start." The men gathered around, eager to begin. As they worked, Samuel felt a sense of fulfillment, something he had not experienced in years. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about building a legacy, a community that could stand together against the wilderness. And with each log, each nail driven into the earth, Samuel knew that something greater was taking shape. The months passed swiftly, and the work on the new cabins continued to progress. Samuel's reputation had spread far beyond the nearby settlements, and people from other parts of the Rockies began to come for his expertise. His knowledge was sought after by men and women alike, all eager to build homes that would stand the tests of time and nature. The community was slowly growing, not just in numbers but in strength, as Samuel passed on what he had learned over the years, the importance of working with the land, of adapting, and of never cutting corners when it came to survival. But as winter approached, bringing with it the promise of cold winds and heavy snows, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. He had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that nature could be unpredictable. The storm that had hit earlier in the year had been bad, but there were whispers in the wind, the rustling of the trees that told him this winter would be harsher. It wasn't just the cold he feared, it was the chance that the community he had worked so hard to build might not survive it. One evening, as the men worked late to finish the last of the roofs, the temperature dropped sharply, and the wind began to pick up. Samuel stopped, wiping his brow, and listened. The howl of the wind through the trees sounded different, more ominous. It wasn't just a gust, it was a wall of cold that was barreling toward them. "Jacob," Samuel called, his voice urgent. "We need to finish securing the last few logs. This storm's coming fast." Jacob looked up from his work, his face pale. "You're right. I've been watching the skies all day. It's going to be a bad one." They worked quickly, securing the logs and reinforcing the roofs. Samuel had prepared for storms, but this felt different, more insistent, as if the wilderness itself was testing the strength of the cabins he had built. It was no longer just a test of his own survival, it was a test of the community's resolve. As the first snowflakes began to fall, Samuel took a moment to look at the cabin in front of him. It was strong, built with care, and reinforced by everything he had learned. It was a symbol of the resilience that he had worked so hard to instill in the people around him. The others were already inside, huddled by their fires. But Samuel knew that this storm was going to be their hardest test yet. The wind howled as the storm intensified, the snow falling in thick sheets. The temperature plummeted, and the air became almost too cold to breathe. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Samuel sat by the hearth, watching the snow accumulate outside, the winds battering the walls. The storm raged on for hours, its fury relentless. But when morning came, and the wind finally began to die down, the cabin stood strong, their foundations firm. Samuel stepped outside, his breath turning to mist in the crisp air. The storm had passed, but the wilderness had made its point. It was always watching, always testing. And once again Samuel's cabins had held firm, proving that even in the harshest conditions, there was strength to be found in the land, in the work, and in the community they had built together. The mountain had tested them, and they had passed. As winter wore on, the storm's aftermath left a quiet stillness in the air. The community that had gathered around Samuel's cabin stood stronger, more connected than ever. The roads were blocked with snow, and it was impossible to travel to other settlements, so for the time being, they were all reliant on one another. There was a peace in that, an unspoken understanding that survival was no longer an individual effort but a shared responsibility. Samuel had never anticipated that his desire to build a sturdy cabin would evolve into something much larger. He'd built to survive alone, but now he saw that survival was possible only when a community worked together. The shared labor of building cabins had forged lasting bonds between neighbors. And more importantly, it had formed a support system, something that could withstand not only the harsh physical forces of nature, but the emotional toll of living in the wilderness. It wasn't just the physical construction that brought them together. It was the shared meals, the long conversations by the fire, the collective endurance through the winter months. Samuel had always thought of survival in terms of solitary strength, but now he realized that it was the collective strength of everyone working together that made them resilient. One night, after a long day of work, the men gathered in the largest cabin, the one that had been built first, and lit a fire. The wind outside was bitter, the snow piled high, but inside, the warmth was a comfort. Laughter filled the cabin as Jacob and Will told stories of their earlier days, their voices rich with the camaraderie of shared struggle. Samuel sat quietly in the corner, listening to the conversation swirling around him, a small smile tugging at his lips. He had come here for solitude, but what he had found instead was something far greater. He had found family, a community that valued not just survival, but living together in a way that transcended the simple act of surviving. The warmth from the fire danced on the walls, casting long shadows on the faces of the men gathered around. Samuel's eyes flicked from one man to the next. They were all so different, each with a story of their own, but they had one thing in common: the determination to survive. And now, in the midst of the bitter cold and the darkness of winter, they had each other. Jacob, who had once been so skeptical of Samuel's design, leaned forward, his voice serious. "You know, Samuel, you didn't just save us from the cold. You saved us from despair. I never thought I'd make it through another winter alone. But now I feel like we've got a chance. All of us. Together." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of those words. It wasn't just the cabins that had been built. It was trust, hope, and the willingness to share the burden of life in the wilderness. Samuel hadn't just created homes. He had built the foundation for a community that could stand the tests of time, no matter what the wilderness threw their way. As the harsh winter finally began to release its grip on the land, the first signs of spring appeared. The snow that had blanketed the landscape for months began to melt, revealing the earth beneath. It was a slow process, the thawing earth revealing patches of brown and green, but it was enough to ignite hope in the hearts of Samuel and his community. They had made it through the worst of the cold, and now, with the coming of spring, it was time to rebuild, not just their homes, but their lives. For Samuel, the transition from winter to spring was always a time of reflection. The stark beauty of winter gave way to the vibrant life of the warmer months, and it reminded him of how fragile their existence in the wilderness truly was. But the survival of his community through storm and cold had proven something to him that he hadn't fully realized before. No matter how harsh the conditions, they were stronger together. With the arrival of spring, the men turned their attention to rebuilding and fortifying what they had worked so hard to create. The work was no longer about survival. It was about growth. They began clearing the land around the cabins, planting gardens, and preparing for the summer months. The heavy labor that had dominated their days in the winter now gave way to lighter, more hopeful work. Samuel's thoughts often drifted back to the beginning, to when he had first built his cabin alone, unsure of what would come next. He had built it to keep the cold out, to survive. But now, as he stood alongside his neighbors, working to improve their homes and prepare for the next season, he saw the true power of what they had accomplished. It wasn't just about the structures or the resources. It was about the bonds they had forged, the trust they had built. One afternoon, while working alongside Jacob, Samuel felt a sense of peace settle over him that he had not known in years. The sun warmed his back as he dug into the earth, preparing a small garden by the side of the cabin. Jacob worked beside him, planting seeds for the season to come. The sound of the shovel cutting into the soil, the rustling of the trees in the breeze, the quiet murmur of the men working together, all of it felt like the beginning of something new. "The earth softening up," Jacob remarked, wiping his brow. "Feels like a fresh start, doesn't it?" Samuel nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the snow-capped peaks still loomed in the distance. "It does. The storm's passed. And now it's time to build something that lasts, not just for us, but for the generations to come." The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land as the work continued. There was still much to do, many challenges ahead. But Samuel knew now that they were ready. Together they had built a community, a foundation of strength, and a shared understanding of survival. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Samuel felt hopeful. The wilderness would always be harsh, but with the bonds they had formed, there was no storm they couldn't weather. As summer's warmth began to spread across the land, Samuel's sense of peace was marred by a growing realization. His role in this community had evolved. He was no longer just a builder, a man who had come to survive. He had become a leader, a figure of guidance and strength, and though he welcomed the respect of his neighbors, the weight of their expectations began to feel like a heavy burden. It wasn't that he resented helping others, far from it. He had taught them how to build their homes, how to survive the harshness of the mountains. But as more settlers arrived, each bringing their own hopes and doubts, Samuel felt the pressure of their trust resting squarely on his shoulders. Jacob, now one of his closest friends, noticed the shift in Samuel's demeanor. One evening, as the fire crackled and the night air cooled, Jacob leaned over, his voice low. "You've been quieter lately, Samuel. Something on your mind?" Samuel exhaled, looking at the fire's flickering light. "It's this role I've taken on. I didn't ask for it, but now everyone looks to me for answers. I'm not sure I have all the answers anymore." Jacob nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're not alone in this, you know. We're all in it together. But you've got something they don't. Wisdom. Don't be afraid to share it." Samuel sighed, appreciating Jacob's words. As much as he tried to hide it, the responsibility weighed on him. But Jacob was right. The strength of this community lay in the shared effort of all, not just in one person's hands. Together, they could face whatever challenges the wilderness had in store. The seasons seemed to change with remarkable speed. The summer's golden warmth turned to the crisp chill of fall, and the community Samuel had helped build continued to grow. As winter approached once again, there was a sense of quiet pride among the settlers. Their homes, solid and enduring, stood as a testament to their hard work and Samuel's guidance. Samuel spent his days preparing for the cold months ahead, stocking supplies, reinforcing cabins, and teaching the next generation the skills needed to survive. He had become a part of the land itself, a fixture in the mountain's ever-changing landscape. Yet as the years passed, Samuel began to realize that the legacy he had hoped to create wasn't one that could be defined by the homes or the techniques alone. It was the community that had grown from his efforts, the relationships forged in the fire of struggle, and the shared commitment to survive together that was his true legacy. One evening, as the first snow of the season gently fell, Samuel stood outside his cabin, watching the quiet beauty of the mountains. The wind had calmed, and the world was still. He could hear the faint sounds of children playing nearby, their laughter echoing through the trees. The community was thriving, and it was no longer just about surviving. They were living, thriving in the harshest of environments, bound together by their shared resilience. Samuel smiled quietly to himself, content. The wilderness had tested him. It had broken him at times. But in the end, it had forged something even stronger, a lasting, silent legacy of survival, unity, and hope. Years passed, and the mountain winters became a familiar rhythm. Samuel had seen the faces of his neighbors change as families grew and new settlers arrived. The once sparse community had blossomed into something that now seemed permanent, a living testament to what could be built in the harshest of conditions. But with the passage of time came an undeniable shift. Samuel's hands, once strong and steady, now trembled slightly as he worked. The labor that had once been second nature was now slower, more deliberate. The fire inside him still burned bright, but his body was beginning to show the strain of years spent in the mountains. As he sat on the porch of his cabin one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jacob came to sit beside him. The years had softened both of them, but Jacob's spirit remained as strong as ever. "You've built more than just a cabin, Samuel," Jacob said, his voice filled with quiet reverence. "You've built a home for all of us, a place where we can live, not just survive." Samuel's eyes softened as he looked out over the community. "It's been a long road," he said, his voice low, "but it's been worth it. To see what we've become, how far we've come." He trailed off, his gaze distant. The truth was, Samuel had never expected to live this long. His original goal had been simple: to survive. But in the process he had built something far greater, a place where others could thrive, not just endure. And in the quiet of that evening, with the mountains stretching endlessly before him, Samuel understood something he hadn't before. His life, his work, would continue through the generations to come. It was the legacy of survival, of community, that would outlast him. The end came as quietly as the snow that blanketed the land. Samuel had grown old, the weight of time bearing down on him like the very mountains he had once conquered. His hands were stiff, his steps slower, but his mind remained sharp. It was a peaceful morning, the air crisp with the promise of winter, when Samuel knew his time was drawing near. He had seen the future take root in the hands of those he had taught. His work was done, and the community he had helped build would carry on long after he was gone. The cabin he had built, the cabin that had started it all, stood strong, just as it had when it was first erected. But Samuel no longer sought to add to it or to fix what wasn't broken. He had seen everything he needed to see. The community had thrived, the lessons he had taught were being passed down to new generations, and the spirit of survival had become woven into the fabric of their lives. On the day that Samuel passed, it was as if the mountain itself had decided it was time to let him go. The air was still, the snow had softened, and for the first time in years, the winds of the Rockies were calm. The community gathered in silence, their hearts heavy, but their spirits full of gratitude. They knew that Samuel's legacy wasn't just in the cabins he had built, it was in the lives he had shaped, the hope he had instilled, and the strength he had taught them to carry on. As they laid him to rest beneath the towering pines, the mountains stood as silent witnesses, marking the end of an era. But Samuel's work lived on, not in stone or wood, but in the hearts of those who would continue to live, to thrive, in the place he had made their home.